TELF, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning and welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, local governments push back on AI data centers and lawmakers wrestle with the state budget. We talk about that and the latest on the JEA investigations with our political analyst, Chris Hand. Then, the rise of the infertility doula. We talk with two local practitioners about how their own experience helps prepare others as they begin the costly and emotionally taxing experience. And from the streets of Jacksonville to the waters of the St. Johns, the toughest athletes brace for this weekend's competition. We meet a competitor and coach for the Jacksonville inaugural Ironman. Join the conversation. Give us a call on air at 904-549-2937 or head to firstcoastconnect.org to find other ways to connect with us. Stick around. We'll be back right after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The U.S. and China have released statements about President Trump and President Xi's meeting today. The U.S. readout says they discussed economic cooperation. China's readout says it warned the U.S. that mishandling the issue of Taiwan could lead to conflict between the U.S. and China. Susan Thornton is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs.
The Chinese statement is quite similar to previous statements, maybe a little bit more strident, but it's very similar to sort of warnings they've made in the past. And the U.S. statement, of course, doesn't mention Taiwan at all. There was some speculation before this meeting that perhaps President Trump would say something new about Taiwan. From these readouts, it doesn't appear that much new has happened on Taiwan here, which will bring great relief to those in Taiwan watching this.
She spoke to NPR's Morning Edition. Ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains mostly closed. Today, India's government says one of its ships off the coast of Oman was attacked, but says the Indian crew has been rescued. As the strait remains mostly closed, more commercial ships are traveling through the Panama Canal in Central America. NPR's Jackie Northam reports.
The Panama Canal Authority says daily transits have increased more than 10% over the past 2 months. But the biggest change has been the types of vessels using the canal. The number of container ships has dipped slightly, while the number of tankers carrying oil and liquefied natural gas has jumped 29% as they search for other options beyond the Strait of Hormuz. They are last-minute reservations and have to use an auction system. In April, fees averaged $380,000, nearly 6 times higher than before the start of the Iran war. The Panama Canal Authority says some vessels are paying more than $1 million to cross. Jackie Northam, NPR News.
The parent company of classroom management platform Canvas has struck a deal with hackers. The saboteurs took the software offline and threatened to leak student data without a ransom. NPR's Sequoia Carrillo reports the terms of their arrangement were not disclosed.
When students and teachers logged onto Canvas last week in the middle of finals season, many were met with a black screen with a note from a ransomware group demanding money in exchange for control back of the platform. The platform came back online a short while later, but the state of the stolen data remained a question for a few days. Now, Instructure, the parent company of the software, has released a statement saying an agreement was met with the bad actors in exchange for return of the data, destruction of data, and promises for no extortion of any Instructure customers. The statement did not say whether payment was involved in the deal. Sequoia Carrillo, NPR News.
And you're listening to NPR News from Washington.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. The Jacksonville City Council is moving forward with funding to restore the historic Stanton School building in La Villa. Lawmakers approved an ordinance which reappropriates more than $143,000 for repairs at the 109-year-old structure this week. That money is the second half of a $300,000 city investment first approved in 2021. Councilmember Rockman Johnson introduced the bill and says the nonprofit Historic Stanton, Inc. will use the money to make repairs, including stabilizing the roof, restoring electrical service, completing masonry work, and more. The building is set to be transformed into a cultural space with an entertainment venue, gallery, and educational space. The three-story school building on Ashley Street was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1983 and is considered Florida's first official school for African Americans. It originally opened in 1869. Florida Education Commissioner Anastasios Kamoutsas is in line to become the next president at Polk State College in Polk County. The college announced Kamoutsas was the only finalist in the school's presidential search yesterday. He will make a campus visit early next month, and the Board of Trustees will make a recommendation after that. Kamoutsas was named the 29th Education Commissioner in June last year. Previously, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Ron DeSantis. It'll be dry, sunny, and breezy today here in Northeast Florida. Temperatures will eventually reach the upper 80s.
Support for NPR comes from the Skoll Foundation, dedicated to powering social innovators to transform the world. Learn more at skoll.org. And Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning and welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, City Council ignores the wishes of the business community to end its JEA investigation. Local governments resist data centers, and affordable housing remains elusive, even as some say Jacksonville ranks among the best markets for first-time buyers. Later in the program, local infertility doulas give birth to a new business model helping individuals and couples trying to conceive. But first, we're joined, as we are each month, by attorney, author, and local government expert Chris Hand to help us make sense of the political world. Chris, thanks for being here.
And great to see you as always.
It's great to have you as always. So I want to start, if we can, by this special session that's happening in Tallahassee right now. Can you sort of catch us up? This is finally budget time for our lawmakers.
Well, this is the second year in a row, of course, the Florida legislature has not passed a budget. It's one constitutional obligation during its regular legislative session. So they've had to come back in overtime. Special sessions, Floridians are no strangers to special sessions. We're having a lot of these days. In fact, someone just did a count, and I think there's been 5 during the period of the current House Speaker and Senate President,
Wow.
and, of course, Governor DeSantis. And there might be another one coming on property taxes later this year as well. But the legislature came back officially in session this week, Tuesday, May the 12th. They'll be in session through Friday, May the 29th, to pass a budget for the next fiscal year, the fiscal year starting on July 1, going through June 30th of 2027. And right now what the legislators are doing, Ann, is just trying to get on the same page. They've kind of divided up into committees on key sort of spending matters to see if they can resolve their differences. Any issues they can't resolve this week during that committee process will get what's called bumped up to the leadership. So that'll go directly to the budget chiefs and the State House Speaker and the Senate President to try and resolve any details. But apparently the goal is to have lawmakers come back after Memorial Day to pass a budget. Under state rules, the way this works is once a budget is finalized, they have to do what's called lay it on the table for 72 hours before they can actually pass it. But the plan is to accomplish all of that before the end of the month. So Florida does have a budget that'll start on July the 1st.
And we know that there has been this sort of major gap, more than about $1.5 billion between what the House and the Senate have proposed. Do we know what sort of some of the main areas of sticking points are? I mean, obviously there's big buckets of health spending and education, environment. Do we know what areas are particularly tender right now?
I think really across the board, there's some differences. As you say, the Senate initially kind of wanted to pass a budget with about $115 billion number. The House is a smaller, $113.6 billion. And I think you see differences kind of across a variety of the different sort of subject areas. For example, one area where there's a fairly large difference between the Senate and the House right now is over the issue of how much to spend on Everglades restoration. There's about just based on the current offers that are being made, there's a several $100 million gap right now in kind of what Florida would contribute to that effort. So it really is, you look across the different areas, whether that's education, the three main buckets the state spends money on before they even got to this process, before they even got to this special session, and they had to agree on what are called the allocations. That's how much money is going to be directed to certain budget areas of what's called general revenue, kind of the biggest part of the budget. They agreed that about $23 billion is going to go to education, both K-12 and higher ed spending, but there are differences within that as to how that would be allocated. About $7 billion to criminal justice, but again, differences in how that would be spent. So you see those differences across the board. I think one thing that legislators are preparing for, and State Senator Don Gates from the Panhandle said this, said, look, there's less to spend this year, and there's probably even going to be even less to spend in future years as some of the state's revenue picture changes. So I think one issue legislators are anticipating somewhat is not just what is this year's budget going to look like, but what is next year's budget going to look like as well.
You mentioned Gates. He has repeatedly called out his colleagues for this delayed session and their inability to come to agreement the last couple of years. He called it embarrassing, and he said that, it's been grudges, personality. This is obviously a completely Republican-controlled body. How do you explain how combative it is? It's not like this is a partisan fight every year that they're having.
I think it's a good example, Ann, of how it's just too reductive to think of things as Democrat or Republican, particularly when it comes to some of these sorts of matters. Partisan affiliation is a lot sort of maybe less significant than things like personality and philosophy that go into these types of things. Look, the dynamics in Tallahassee for the last couple of years have been that the governor and the state house speaker are not aligned. They have been at odds on a variety of issues. A number of priorities that the governor has wanted to advance, the state house has declined. We saw that just in the last special session, the one that happened just a couple of weeks ago, where the state declined to move forward on some priorities the governor had with an AI Citizens Bill of Rights and issues of vaccine mandates and those sorts of issues. The House just refused to take them up like they did during the regular session. So I think that's been a major part of the dynamic. I will say, if you look over the grand sweep of history of the Florida legislature, that's not an unusual dynamic that a state, a leader of one of the state or maybe both of the houses of the legislature might not see eye to eye with the governor. I think it's surprising to some people in the context of the last 8 years. For the first 6 years of his administration, Governor DeSantis was largely able to move his priorities through the legislature. But that changed, and the state house speaker has sort of asserted the House's authority as a co-equal branch of government. Now, the Senate has a closer relationship with the governor, and perhaps because of those dynamics, the Senate and the House have had some challenges getting on the same page during this session. They have to pass a budget, so it seems likely they will do that. I mean, and we're now in the sort of horse trading part of the budget where they kind of get to the finish line. I think the even bigger question will be, do the House and Senate come back for one final special session sometime this summer to try and put some sort of property tax amendment on the November ballot? I think that'll be, once this budget is wrapped, that'll be the last question for the Florida legislature to answer.
Something we'll all be watching very closely. We are talking to Chris Hand. He is an attorney, government expert. He is our political analyst, and we're talking about recent headlines. You're welcome to join our conversation. If you have a comment or a question, you can call us on air at 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us. I want to move on now to a city topic. This is a decision that the Jacksonville City Council made to essentially ignore a request from some of the biggest players in the local business community. The Civic Council, the Jacksonville Civic Council, which weighs in periodically on major issues of civic import. They had said, please pull back from your JEA investigation. You're doing damage. And the City Council said, we're going to continue the work of the special committee.
It's interesting to see how these things kind of evolve over time. Back maybe 15 years ago, the Civic Council is an organization that formed in 2010, kind of comprised of, basically chief executive officers, primarily from Jacksonville or Northeast Florida-based businesses. There was a time where the Civic Council and the Jacksonville City Council were very much in lockstep on a variety of issues. not surprisingly, things change over time, and that's obviously not the case anymore. I mean, the Civic Council has now come out and said that JEA, they don't want the City Council Special Committee to continue, that they should defer to the JEA board and some of the ongoing investigations. And, members of council have essentially said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to move forward anyway. So there is sort of a different relationship between the Civic Council and the City Council than there was, just 10 to 15 years ago.
What do you think is behind that? I mean, you talk about the Civic Council being created in 2010. Before that, there was a period where it was a little more mysterious. Its membership wasn't really on a website. It was called the non-group.
Exactly.
And they were seen as behind the curtain operators, pulling the strings, influencing certainly elections with their deep pockets, but also policy. So what has changed in terms of either the makeup of our current city council or the makeup of this group of executives that they're not as influential as maybe they once were?
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready to say they're either more or less influential than they were. I just think city council is different than it was, 10 to 15 years ago. And whereas 10 to 15 years ago, a business group like the Civic Council or the Chamber might be seen as having kind of the most important impact on a body like the city council, there are now a variety of different sort of actors and stakeholders that have impact there. So, I think it used to be they were sort of preeminent in that regard, and now they're not alone in that effort. There are multiple kind of groups and people at the table who can have impact on city council.
Do you think the city council is therefore more independent, or do you think they're just beholden to a different cohort?
Well, I think we live in an era where there are sort of voices and information and data and opinions coming from a variety of different sources. Politics have changed, political parties have changed, elected officials have changed. So, change is the law of life, as the old expression goes. And so, again, I think it's, the Civic Council and organizations like that continue to weigh in and to try and shape city issues. I just think we have a different city council and a different political reality than we did 15 years ago. It will be interesting to see how this investigation continues forward. Look, I mean, I think just a level set for our listeners a little bit. Council does have oversight authority over the consolidated government. I mean, they do have the ability to call special committees, conduct oversight through their regular committees as well, and to look into city issues. The concern that some have raised is, where do you draw that line with an independent authority like JEA? Remember that, in our charter, there are multiple independent authorities that were set up to essentially run business operations of the city of Jacksonville. So whether that's the JEA, the Jacksonville Aviation Authority, JEA, the JPA, the Jacksonville Port Authority, or JAXPort, the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. The idea behind the independent agencies was there are certain business functions of the city that are sort of best run through organizations that are independent and sort of out from general government. That's been a long-running debate in consolidation. Where do you draw that line between the relationship between city government in general and the independent authorities? And when you look over the course of history of consolidated government, there have been times where that has been a truly independent relationship where, again, the city council has taken a look at those budgets each year, maybe sort of conducted some general oversight, but for the most part left those agencies alone to do their work. There have been times where that association has been much closer, where City Hall has been much more aligned with those agencies and much more engaged in their day-to-day operation. I think what we're seeing right now is that historic push-pull between the independent authorities and City Hall to figure out what that balance looks like. And there are those, again, like the Civic Council, like the mayor, who have argued that City Council is providing more oversight than it should, given that independent relationship. There are others who say, look, JEA is an organization that's owned by the city. Ratepayers are taxpayers, and to the extent they are, for example, spending $1.5 billion on a new natural gas plant, or maybe they aren't kind of collecting the water capacity fees that they're supposed to be, that's an appropriate subject for council oversight. So we're going to continue to have that debate, even whether it's on these issues that are present right now, or whether that's going to be on other issues in the future, because, again, there is that tension between city agencies that are designed to be independent, where do you draw that line, and how do you strike that balance?
Right. And what kind of autonomy do you allow that board? I mean, you can almost see an apples to apples comparison between this concern the council is expressing right now over JEA's decision to put down a bunch of money on a turbine for this plant, saying, well, if the permit's denied, if the state doesn't allow the construction of this plant, we're out all this money. JEA is saying, well, we had to essentially put a down payment on this. It takes so long to get them. We're in line now for construction on this important piece of equipment. At the same time, over at JTA, there is this enormously expensive Skyway conversion project that has also been the subject of a lot of consideration and concern and teeth gnashing by some city council members. But that decision, I mean, you'll recall that the head of JTA was essentially called before the council to talk about it. Rory Diamond asked him, what role does the council have? And Nat Ford basically said none. This is us. This is our decision. We're an independent authority. We're going to be making this decision. We welcome, your feedback. But it does seem like a very different approach in terms of that micromanaging, or at least that really hands-on look at how somebody is managing an agency when it comes to controversial expenditures.
Yeah, and I think that will be the continuing debate here. What is the appropriate role for a body like City Council in providing oversight over these different authorities? Look, the authorities come to City Council each year to provide their budgets and to have the council conduct budget oversight. I think that's going to be a continuing debate here. Beyond that budget oversight, what is City Council's proper role in conducting oversight over the operations of these authorities themselves? I will say, I think it's very important for the public, for the media, and for consolidated government to be mindful of the operations of these independent authorities. A lot of money is spent in those authorities. They do really important work. I think they should. I don't think anyone disagrees they should be subject to oversight. I don't think the independent authorities would disagree that they should be subject to oversight. But that's really the debate we're seeing right now, Ann. How do you strike that balance? Where do you draw that line? What's proper? For example, one debate in this current JEA process has been, to what extent does City Council have the right to survey JEA employees? I mean, about sort of some of these issues that have come up. I mean, one of the longtime sort of stances has been that the independent authorities have the right and the obligation to manage their own employees. That is not really a function that kind of central city government should handle. Obviously, this investigation has delved into that to some extent. So again, we're going to see this tension, this balance striking that's going to go on in that effort. But that's the reason for some of the controversy right now. Some feeling that City Council has stepped over the line and is doing more than the type of oversight City Council should be doing in this situation.
We're talking to attorney and political analyst Chris Hand. And I want to turn to an email that we got, kind of dialing back to our conversation about the legislature in session. Karen saying, please give us an update on the status of property tax legislation.
That's a great question. I think a lot of people are looking for an update on that right now. As we know, during the regular session, the House did pass a proposed property tax amendment that would essentially, over the next decade, eliminate all non-school homestead taxes. Now, for example, when you get your tax bill and you see the property tax bill, there's a portion that goes to city and county governments, depending on where you live, and then there's a portion that goes to schools. The schools portion would be unaffected by this House plan. The portion that goes to local government, if you have a homestead property, it would sort of essentially phase out property taxes on that homestead property over the next decade. The Senate has not passed a proposed constitutional amendment. Under our state constitution, the way this works is both houses have to pass it for that to go on the November 2026 ballot. The big unanswered question right now is, what is the governor's plan going to look like? He's been talking about this property taxes issue for over a year now, saying that this was a priority, something that needed to be on the November 2026 ballot, but neither he nor his office have actually released a proposed amendment right now. But what he has suggested is that he's going to bring the House and the Senate back into session sometime this summer so that a consensus proposal can be put on the ballot in November. When that session might be, we don't know. It will presumably be sometime after the current special session ends, which is on May the 29th. What the governor's proposal will look like, we also do not know. What the Senate might propose, we do not know. I think a lot of those are still unanswered questions that we'll learn more about as we get into June and July.
Sure. And we talked to the mayor earlier this week, and she said that planning for those potentials is something that their budget is very much taking into account, not knowing what sort of essentially property tax revenue could be coming in.
That's going to be an imperative for every city and county government in the state. This is a massive, massive fiscal impact, depending, of course, on what the final amendment looks like. But, for example, just take the House one. There's been a variety of analyses done on that, and the impact on local governments is likely to be very significant, and that goes directly to some of the core services that people think about when it comes to government, whether that's parks or public works, or even things like trash pickup. So there's a lot of core services that are funded by ad valorem or property tax revenue. So city and county governments around Florida really at the moment sitting on the edge of their seats from a budget planning standpoint, trying to figure out what this might look like going forward.
All right. I want to ask about AI data centers, because this is an issue that has been getting increasing attention at the federal level. At the state level, we saw some legislation that was signed into law by the governor. But at the local level, we've been seeing county governments start to wrestle with this. There was reports about a parcel of land that was for sale potentially as a data center in St. Johns County, although I don't think anybody has expressed interest in making that purchase. Nassau County, meanwhile, had a meeting this week to put pause on a future development of any kind while they get their ducks in a row. So there is a strong sense that people are concerned proactively, prophylactically, trying to make sure that they're ready should these applications come in.
Well, I mean, I think data centers are generally here to stay. I mean, Americans aren't consuming and utilizing any less data. I mean, that's going to continue to grow over time. So there's going to be sort of a big debate over where these data centers are going to be located. And as you say, Ann, there's concern in local communities about the impact of what those might look like. In Nassau County, they're considering a moratorium on data centers and a moratorium on any development approvals that would allow data centers to come in while they assess what the infrastructure impact would be, what the utility impact would be, what the water and environmental impact would be. That's really the concern about data centers, is what sort of impact do they have on local communities. I think as people has analyzed this, they're concerned about the amount of water that data center uses and what that, might take away from local uses. The impact on utilities. Data centers can utilize a lot of electricity. That could, people are concerned, have an impact on what utility rates, energy costs look like. And so because of those types of concerns, there's been some marshaling of effort in local communities, but also statewide. The governor just signed a bill, not the full AI Citizens Bill of Rights that he was looking for, but a truncated version that goes directly to the data centers issue. And what that bill does, which again, the governor just in the last couple of weeks has signed that into law, essentially sort of prohibits local utilities or any utilities from raising the rates, the energy rates of consumers, residential and commercial customers, based on the added energy needs of data centers. It also kind of reiterates that local communities have development control and have the right to turn down data centers if they don't want them to come there. It also, I mean, it's a little bit, it goes counter to some of the things we've seen in Tallahassee in recent years. Sure. It also puts stricter permitting in place. If a data center goes to get what's called a consumptive use permit, which is a way that you access, the aquifer, water for use in your data center, there are now stricter requirements to get that the consumptive use permit if you are a data center. So the governor passed that legislation. He's really been on the forefront of expressing skepticism about data centers, saying that he wants to protect local communities' right to decide if they're going to have data centers or not. This is going to be a continuing issue that Florida and all states will wrestle with as various companies kind of figure out how they are going to manage data. There was a statistic, I think it was back in maybe in March, Reuters reported that of several of the big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, others, are planning on spending more than $600 billion on data centers in 2026 alone. So we're talking about massive investments around the country, and there is concern in local communities about what that might mean for them.
I'm so curious to see the litigation that arises from the first data center that is rejected under those provisions? Because it seems to me that there is so much precedent in Florida for the issuance of consumptive use permits to large users without any regard for what the local community wants or what the resource is able to provide, and why a data center would be different from a bottling company that's selling water or a paper mill that is, I mean, there are so many water users, or a massive development, on the scale of Anacati, to say, well, why are they permitted to use this enormous amount of water to water lawns, and this data center that's going to be providing this use to so many hundreds of thousands of people doesn't it seem to you that even though there's this legislation, that is just going to invite litigation, because there is so much permissible development in this state that local governments don't have any say in?
There's no question that at some point this is going to shift to the venue of the courts, right? I mean, at the moment, this is in, city and county commissions and the state legislature, but at some point this is going to shift to the courts. What will be interesting to watch is, look, there are parts of the country, and as you know, that are kind of actively courting data centers. For example, there are parts of the state of Louisiana where they want data centers to be located there because they do provide employment and economic activity for areas. At some point, we're going to run out of places in the country that are actively courting data centers, and some of these issues that we're talking about this morning are really going to be kind of decided on a community by community basis. And ultimately, look, that's where these decisions probably should be made. Local communities should have the ability to make decisions about, whether they want data centers located there or not. But as you say, this implicates a lot of legal issues in terms of if somebody buys property intending to put up a data center, but they're denied the right to build that is potentially a route to court. Or as you say, if they're subjected to different requirements to go get that water permit, that consumptive use permit, that may be a right to court. So I don't think there's any question that you're right. At some point, a lot of these issues are going to end up in the judicial system.
We do know, though, that this measure that the governor signed and what counties like Nassau County are doing is enormously popular. A recent poll showed that essentially more than 9 out of 10 people polled support restrictions on data centers, and there was just an infinitesimally small number of people that did not want to see at least some measures in place to prevent them from having wholesale rights or access to the electrical grid, water supplies.
Right, you're referring to a poll that Sachs Media did kind of in the, around the time of when the governor signed this bill. And as you say, 9 out of 10 people polled supported the legislation and want to have restrictions on data centers. I think part of the issue right now is this issue has just sort of emerged very quickly with potentially huge impacts on local communities. It's not surprising that people are taking a minute to try and figure out what kind of data centers are and what this might mean for the quality of life in their community. So I think what Nassau County did, for example, in starting to slow down this process and potentially have a moratorium, is something that you are likely to see in cities and counties around the country as they try to get a handle on this data center explosion and what it might mean for them.
I'm going to take a call from Mary Ann in East Arlington. Good morning, Mary Ann. Go ahead.
Hi. I am not from Jacksonville originally. I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, and I don't know if any of you have paid attention to what's going on there. Drought-wise, the combined water that is feeding to Nueces County is currently sitting at less than 8% of capacity. And there is a data center going up adjacent to Nueces County. And if you pay attention to that and consider the fact that these AI data centers draw so much water, it's not a good thing for Florida. I think that the governments need to enact laws that require these data centers to build desalination plants and come up with other sources of water for their needs, and to not use our water sources that we use for drinking.
Thanks, Mary Ann. It's interesting because we did just get an email yesterday from the St. Johns River Water Management District noting that they're now in a phase 3 extreme water shortage era, which essentially further limits residential landscape irrigating. And it's something we talked about on this program that, certainly there's a drought happening, but in terms of the water shortage that's being experienced, that's largely contingent on the fact that about half of our water goes to watering lawns in Florida, as opposed to uses that might be considered more fundamentally necessary.
Well, I think the caller raises what for many people is the most profound concern about data centers, which is their use of water. I mean, some of the studies done of data center have kind of looked at what's the amount of electronic waste that they might, produce over time. But water has also been, there's certain, I'm trying to remember the exact statistic I saw, but there are certain data centers that, based on their size, may use as much water as an entire sort of small or medium-sized city in some situations. So what the caller is referring to is a very massive concern, particularly when you're in the middle of drought conditions. I hadn't heard that suggestion before about requiring them to build desalination plants. That's an interesting idea that we'll see if that sort of is something that local communities look at. But there's no doubt that what the caller has identified, and I didn't realize that it was as much of an issue as it is in Corpus Christi, but I think you're going to see that around the country as we have limited water resources. As local communities try to figure out how to manage those limited water resources, how do they keep up with the demands that data centers have for water while still providing for the everyday water needs of citizens in their communities, people who are also ratepayers of the utilities that manage and provide that water. I think this is going to be an issue that communities are grappling with for many years to come.
Yeah. I do just briefly want to touch on affordable housing, because this is an issue that has been a priority of the Deegan administration, but has not always been as supported by some folks on council. She's moving into a new budget cycle, obviously, here. And, there's also money that's been earmarked for spending on affordable housing that the city's a little behind on spending, and now has to kind of earmark or begin spending or lose.
That's right. I mean, over the last 3 years, the city has gotten about, I think, $30 million from what's called the SHIP program, which is a state program designed to make sure that local communities have money they can utilize for the purpose of creating affordable or attainable housing. Now, look, the fact that that money exists at all is a little bit of a change, because for years the Florida legislature would generally sweep that money back into the budget, so there was just less of that SHIP money available. So, the good news from a, city and county standpoint is some of those funds are available, but it can be difficult to spend sometimes. And so the city is now, they've spent, I think they've got about $13 million of that, $28 million that has not yet been spent, and they're trying to find ways to do that. I'm sure we'll hear more, as the mayor referred to on your show the other day, in her budget. She also appeared recently before the iCare organization here in town, and they asked her to commit to putting $10 million into an affordable housing trust fund that would, help first-time homebuyers with down payment assistance, would provide, housing to low-income Jacksonville residents, and a variety of other, needs as well. She said that, she promised that she would put as much money as she could into a affordable housing trust fund, depending on what the budget looked like. So
Stopped short of that full.
Short of the full promise, which again, I think, she understands that there's a budget coming up and she's going to be constrained by what the city revenue looks like. So until you know what that looks like, it's difficult to sort of make a full promise in that regard. But I think this is, again, going to be a defining issue. She has said it's the most important kind of priority of her administration to deal with affordable and attainable housing. The piece of good news about Jacksonville, as the New York Times recently reported, Jacksonville is number one on the list of cities where home ownership is available, where, in other words, where the amount of rents and the amount of mortgages is close enough that people can kind of transition from being renters to being owners. The New York Times reported this Zillow study that found Jacksonville number one in that regard. So that's a positive statistic for the community, but it still is a question of trying to marshal resources and make sure that there are a variety of housing options available at different income levels so that it is affordable or attainable.
Well, Chris Hand, it is always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to see you, Ann. Take
care. All right,
care.
We'll see you next month. Up next, from helping prepare for the emotional and financial costs of IVF, we learn about the work of an infertility doula from two local practitioners. Welcome back. Individuals and couples struggling to conceive face a slew of challenges, from the sheer cost of in vitro fertilization to the physical and emotional toll of the process. In response, a new community of helpers has emerged, known as fertility or infertility doulas. Here to tell us about the practice and what they provide, we're joined by two local practitioners. Marissa Colon, she is a full spectrum doula and a student midwife. Marissa, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Allie Hamrick. She is founder of the Infertility Doula. Hi, Allie.
Hi.
So, Allie, you entered this field after your own experience. What did your experience teach you about what is needed?
Yes, I did. So, my husband and I went through our own infertility journey and ultimately conceived our baby boy through IVF in 2023. I had stage 3 endometriosis, and I just found throughout the entire journey that the support, not only just emotional support, but having somebody who can be an advocate for you and walk alongside you and provide different perspective, is really invaluable. I mean, you can't even put a cost on it. And through going birth as well, hiring a birth doula, which is much more common, and people understand, of course, the benefits to having that kind of support when it comes to birth. I just felt I could apply that same type of support option to the infertility process as well.
And so there's different stages of this process. Each of them have their own terminology, their own costs, their own emotional challenges, and sometimes physical challenges. There can be a painful process. So what kind of stages are you interceding to help your clients, and what are you offering them? Do you just sort of like tell them this is what to expect? These are the choices that you're going to be asked to make?
Yeah, it's a little bit of all of that. So I like to talk about where I come into the process is pre-TTC. So TTC is a pretty common term you'll see around social media or in this world. It means trying to conceive. So it's a pretty common acronym. I like to come in right around the pre-TTC phase for people to really help them. A lot of times when people are getting diagnosed with infertility, it's after having subsequent losses or after having to try to conceive for over a year without having success. By that time, you're already drained, you're exhausted, you are grieving, you're dealing with possibly losses, actual real losses as well. And you're looking for a provider to help you and for someone to really just to hold your hand and say, hey, this isn't the end of the road. There are options. And sometimes, yes, it is a medical option. Sometimes, like for my case specifically, it is going to be IVF. It is going to perhaps include surgery or something like that. But oftentimes, you can find other holistic paths, because when you get into the more medical ART functions, you're talking about a really high cost as well. But that's where, my practice comes in. People like Marissa come in to say, hey, there are some other things that we can do to try to help support you and get you to your end goal.
It's interesting, Marissa, because there is, as she says, this preconception period where there are considerations about fertility, but also health in general. And, there are advice that women who are seeking that could perhaps follow that would help in that process and make conception more possible or likelier.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are a lot of barriers and gaps to care when it comes to fertility and infertility, especially within the Black community. We see that they're nearly twice as more likely to suffer from infertility struggles and have a significantly greater disparity when it comes to accessing care, diagnoses, treatment, even to get to that point of trying to conceive. There's a lot of dismissal. There's a lot of dismissal of pain. There is a lot of concern, medical mistrust, especially within the Black and melanated community. So oftentimes by the time they get to us, they've already had several losses. Maybe their labs haven't even been checked for things such as progesterone, which is a huge factor when it comes to infertility, because our uterus is also governed by our hormones, and progesterone is a big one. And sometimes they get to us and they've had 3 or 4 losses before we step in and we ask their doctor, hey, can we get some labs? Can we see where this person's progesterone is at? And then they get on shots, and sometimes it's quite that simple.
But you really have to know the process and the options. And very often, if people are approaching, as you say, from trying to conceive without perhaps undergoing some explanation as to their condition, their situation, whether they have some sort of physical ailment that might prevent them from conceiving, they really are doing so blindly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where we really come into it, because we, in our intake processes, we're asking a lot of questions, and we're not just talking about the woman or the birthing person, we're talking about their partner as well. because this is a shared process. Their DNA deeply contributes, and their health of their sperm motility, their lifestyle, their sleep, their diet, all of that comes into play. And if they have no idea that any of that matters, which the vast majority of us are walking around uneducated, especially our partners, our male partners, then that all contributes to that struggle, that emotional despair sometimes of why am I not conceiving?
What do you find people value the most in your relationship with them in this process? What is it that they often maybe don't know that they need?
I think a lot of times they don't know what to ask for. And so, yes, it is the emotional support, but I think more often than not, it's just being heard and feeling like someone is listening to them and their story. And again, it's having someone to serve as a patient advocate for you. Because a lot of times, if you're going through this for the first time, you've encountered a lot of dismissal. You've been told it's all in your head, just try harder, eat better, this, that. And, I also come from a religious background as well. And in that community, you really don't talk about these medical diagnoses, right? You're just told to pray harder, do this, do that. There's always an external sort of cause for what's happening, when really a lot of times it's just as simple as, hey, let's get a hormone panel. Let's look at your hormones. Maybe you do have a sensitivity to gluten, or you have heightened inflammation in your system. And if we get you on a really, really strict, good, healthy diet for a few months, that might be all it takes. Maybe you do need to get a second opinion from a different fertility doctor, but you need someone to kind of help you, guide you through that process. It is a little bit scary and it can be daunting because there is, you want these people to get you pregnant. You're asking them for something that you so deeply desire. And sometimes you just need a little nudge, someone to hold your hand and go, it's okay. Let's ask for something different. Let's try a different angle.
Yeah, and naturally much more emotional procedure than a lot of medicalized procedures. If you're just joining us, we're talking to two infertility or fertility doulas. And if you have questions or comments, you can email First Coast Connect at wjct.org. Marissa, I was talking to you about, you are also a student midwife. You are a sort of regular birth doula. And so you have run the gamut of experience. But we were talking about how a doula is an expanding definition. There was a time when it was unusual. Now it's much more common in the birth process. But there are now doulas for people who are in hospice. There are even doulas for people who are thinking about having an abortion or needing to have an abortion. And so there's all of these different aspects. What is the unifying aspect of a doula? What is the meaning of a doula?
I would say what unifies all of us is that we're all trying to fill in this space that is largely unrepresented as it relates to care and caring every step of the way. There's a lot that happens in these rooms, these spaces, these offices that is untold. Unfortunately, sometimes we are receiving outright misinformation or even lies. And if an educated person who understands how to operate in that space, understands medical terminology, has held hands through all of these journeys, whether it's from a full spectrum doula really is from preconception all the way through death, and that is why we have death doulas, abortion doulas, birth doulas, fertility doulas, because there are gaps in care every step of the way. Every step of the way.
And because you also deal with, clients of color who may, as you said, feel excluded, have experienced systemic discrimination or bias, do you feel that there's a greater need for that community to have someone as their advocate or as their support?
Absolutely, especially as it relates to someone that represents them as well, where we don't have enough doulas of color, fertility specialists of color. We're not seeing ourselves in these spaces, which only increases that medical mistrust and the barriers that we're receiving. We can go years just being told that it's just pain. Just take some ibuprofen. It's nothing. Their labs aren't getting drawn. Nothing is being done to actually pinpoint whatever it is they're going through and validate their concerns.
Just very briefly, Allie, if somebody is considering reaching out to a doula, what would you ask them to look for?
For in service?
What kind of qualities should they be looking for if they want someone to help them in this process?
I think you want someone who is going to be open-minded, You want someone who isn't going to be tied down to one modality or one, way to get pregnant, because there are so many different ways. And you want someone ultimately that maybe shares lived experience with you, whether that's someone who looks like you or someone who has actually gone through something similar.
Well, Allie Hamrick, Marissa Colon, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, we'll be back next with a competitor and a coach from this weekend's inaugural Jacksonville Ironman.
The Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens presents Art in Bloom, uniting nature and creativity with flowers made of glass, ceramics, paper, wood, and even Lego. On display through September 13th. More information available at cummermuseum.org. Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Even when we drive defensively, accidents can still happen. Do you know what to do next? There's more to it than you might think.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
Thelonious Monk's Straight No Chaser, a rare film and intimate portrait of one of jazz's true originals. Wednesday, May 20th at WJCT Studios. Doors open at 6:30, film at 7. Get your tickets now at wjct.org/film.
Since taking office, President Trump's wealth has grown by at least
$1.4 billion.
There's a Trump fund that doesn't exist, paid pardon schemes, government contracts for his sons.
Why is it appropriate that a company that is backed by the president's son should get a government contract, period?
Trump's catalog of corruption. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Mayors know it better than most. Limited resources can stand in the way of realizing city planning goals. One program aims to address that by funding projects to improve city services in 20 countries. We share our conversation with mayors from 3 different continents on how they're tackling their city's biggest challenges. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. A 112-mile bike ride, a 26.2-mile run, and a 2+ mile swim is a difficult feat to complete in a lifetime, let alone within a few hours. Here to tell us about Jacksonville's inaugural Ironman competition, we're joined by Emily Rogers, a first-time participant. Emily, good morning.
Good morning.
We're also joined by Emily's coach, Sky Johnson, who herself is a 5-time Ironman. Sky, welcome. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
And we're also joined by Ryan Labato. He is the communications manager for the Ironman Group. Ryan, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we are talking about nearly 2,000 athletes. They're going to run the gamut from teenagers 18 to 81. Emily, I want to start with you because this is your first Ironman. First of all, just how are you feeling 2 days out? Are you feeling excited, nervous? What are your emotions?
I was talking to Sky about this. I actually have this odd sense of peace that has come over me, knowing that it's race week. We're here, it's happening, and we're really riding this wave to just get it done. Obviously, the anxiety is going to come tomorrow when I drop my bike off and everything is locked in. But really, I'm so excited and grateful that I've made it through training and I'm at the point where I'm able to participate. So,
how did you get to the point that you knew that you were going to be able to do one of these? And tell us a little bit about some of your high points and your low points in the training.
Absolutely. So I think back in September when they announced the race, there were a lot of us who really had a lot of doubt as to whether or not that was the right thing for us to do to sign up. I personally had never considered doing a full distance Ironman. And it really took a lot of back and forth to decide that this was the way I wanted to go. I had a lot of friends and a big community with Sky and the other athletes that we work with, and we all decided to take that jump together. But during the training process, there have been so many times when you think, oh my gosh, like I have a 20-mile run tomorrow. I had a 100-mile bike yesterday. How am I going to be able to do everything on one day? And I think really having the community that we have and everybody that we've worked together has gotten us to this point. So,
have you done long races before, triathlons before?
Yeah, so I have done half Ironman distance, which is essentially half of the Ironman. And even those seem like so much when you're starting out. I've done two of those and then a lot of smaller triathlons. But it's definitely been a huge leap from that distance to the current one.
Sky, what is it that you are able to bring as a coach? Because I think we all know that this is much more than just a monumental physical accomplishment. This takes something much deeper and more profound for somebody to be able to do this level of athletic of accomplishment.
Sure. So, what I provide, I think, for my athletes is a lot of mindset training and a community to train with, which are two huge components. Emily and I were talking earlier that she couldn't imagine doing it by herself. So, we're out there almost every weekend together as a group, sometimes up to 40 people out on bikes together. And sometimes when somebody's having a bad day, having the other 39 kind of rolling along with you really just helps keep you going. Where if you were by yourself, you might just say, this isn't for me today. And too many of those days in a row can get you in trouble, and then you won't be prepared for the race. So having that community to train with is huge.
And how often does that happen? How much are you having to sort of get people back on the bike, get them back in the water and say, like, you can do this?
Usually every Saturday. Every Saturday there's somebody. They call me Mean Coach Sky when I have to have that conversation with them. But typically I'm just the consummate encourager. But yeah, sometimes you just have to play the tough love and say, this is what it takes. Remember why you started this, and this is the only way to finish is to finish today.
Ryan, this is an enormous undertaking for the city and organizing it. I first of all want to ask you, because the swim is in the St. Johns River. Yep. Tell us what about water quality? What about swimmer safety should we know? Because I think a lot of people have questions about that.
Yeah, first off, I mean, we are just so excited to be here in Jacksonville. This is the first time we've held an event here, so we have a lot of work that we've done over the past 8 months, working with our partners at the city of Jacksonville to do routine water quality testing. We also are going to have the Coast Guard out there. We have hundreds of water assets out on the water to help protect and guide the swimmers as they make it through the water. Our last testing is actually taking place today, but we have full faith that we're going to have an amazing swim on Saturday morning.
Yeah. And there are going to be some major road closures. Yep. We have a link on our website to the maps that show the street closures, downtown for the run, this big loop that goes out to the beach. Really, the only road that's going to be closed all day is this flyover in Nocatee, but the rest, they will kind of have periods of being busy. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I really want to encourage people to come out and check out the event. You don't have to pay to come see our event. So step out on the side of your road, come downtown, watch these swimmers, bikers, and runners, and get inspired, because that's really what we're here to do, is inspire people.
Yeah, and Emily, when you're swimming, you may not be able to see necessarily, but people can see you from the river walk, and that's a great vantage point. Are you going to have some people out there cheering you on? Who's going to be your support team on the ground?
I have a lot of people, obviously, being in my home city. So I'm hoping to see my husband multiple times throughout the course of the day. And I have a lot of friends in the area who I'm expecting to see as well. But then I think my parents are going to try and see me down on A1A. And it's really, an all-day activity. And every time you see someone's face you recognize, or someone who just shouts out your name, it gives you such a boost of energy to get us through that long day.
Well, we will be thinking of you on Saturday, and best of luck. It's an enormous challenge, and I'm sure you'll do awesome. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for listening to our program. Please join us tomorrow when we talk with our media roundtable about recent headlines, including concern about law enforcement response after 2 fatal shootings stemming from mental health crises. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect, Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
Wolfson Children's Hospital, where generations of families have found hope. Because it's here at Wolfson Children's where answers are found, odds are beaten, and comebacks begin every day. Wolfson Children's, always here. Visit wolfsonchildrens.com.